pretty much any sea captain back in those days with an opportunity was a pirate. It was so flexible as a kind of role. So you find they're very, very pervasive. The Crusaders, interestingly, the Crusader states didn't have a navy. And people have often interpreted that as a sign of weakness. I mean, personally, I think it's the opposite. I think it's a sign of strength, as in there were so many Crusader pirates wandering around those seas that they were too dangerous for a lot of the competition. I mean, they were, good sailors, and they'd be merchants part of the year, and they might bring pilgrims over for part of the year, and they might chug up and down the coast part of the year. But when there was an enemy ship, or indeed any ship, we're never too sure what an enemy is, or an opportunity, they changed and they're pirates. And you do find that goes on throughout the whole Crusades. It's not just a Frankish thing. The Muslims have their own pirates too. And, it's always a competitive environment. But yeah, you find that there's a couple of really interesting ones. There's one in particular called Godric the English pirate, who pretty much saved the Crusades. And he was an extraordinary man. I think it sounds like he was Godric of Finchale, and we'll come on to that later. But Godric of Finchale was a merchant seaman, pretty much like a private venture capitalist. Used to take his ship around the North Sea, gradually started venturing into the Mediterranean. His ship was called a bus, by the way, which is what those northern ships were called. So when people talked about, 3 buses all turning up at once, they literally meant it in those days, and it was a bit more scary. So Godric of Finchale, we know, was in the Eastern Mediterranean at the beginning of the Crusades. And there was one incident in particular where Baldwin, who was the king of Jerusalem, very, very bravely but foolishly launched himself and just a few men, about 200 knights, into what he thought was an Egyptian raiding party. And those 200 men were basically the government of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. They were, the great and the good. They were the knights. And those 200 knights charged forward into the Egyptian raiders, only to find that there were about 20,000 of them. It was the full Egyptian army invading, and for whatever reason, they hadn't spotted it. And by the time they got to them, it was too late to get out. They couldn't, they were surrounded. So they charged through, and they eventually, some of the survivors managed to get to a tower. Baldwin was cut his way out, and nearly everybody was killed. So literally most of the government and most of the Crusader senior people in the Latin Kingdom were killed within 2 days. Baldwin staggered around in the wilderness for several days, wounded. He'd been burnt in the fighting, in the breakout, and he staggered down to the Crusader port of Arsuf. In the meantime, because his army had been pretty much wiped out, and he, the king, was lost, everybody had assumed the worst, and people had gathered. So the European settlers had gathered at Jaffa, and they're pretty much preparing to sail back to Europe. So this was 1102. So this is just after the Crusades have started, and they're just about to finish. Literally, the Crusades could have finished at that point. But Baldwin and his trusty horse stagger into Arsuf and rest for about 7 days. They're absolutely exhausted. I think Baldwin probably does have a nervous breakdown, but he does meet a person there who changes everything, changes his life, saves the Crusades, and that is an English pirate called Godric. And Godric had his trusty bus with him, and eventually he stripped the bus down, managed to get Baldwin on board, and broke out through the entire Egyptian navy. There were literally 33 Egyptian ships outside, which sounds like a lot, but it is about the right size for an Egyptian squadron, a strengthened one, and managed to fight his way out. And delivered King Baldwin back to the remnants of his people. Baldwin managed to reform his government and his army and pushed the invaders out. But there was that bizarre time when Godric the English pirate saved the entire Crusades. I think, it probably is the same person as Godric of Finchale, who later became a saint. He also later wrote the earliest surviving piece of English music in the English language, bizarrely. So this guy was multi-talented, I mean, we do know that, Godric, before he became a saint, was a merchant, venture capitalist, that he did lots of dodgy things, and he was in the Mediterranean in 1102 at that time. So personally, I think either it's a big coincidence, and there's another English pirate called Godric, which is great in itself. But personally, I think it was a saint. So I think a saint saved the Crusades